Let's begin with opening prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us to the start of the new week. Thank you for giving us the understanding we have of the message and help us to understand more about the left wing and the far left wing specifically. Help us to understand the lesson for today. And thank you for letting us all be part of the 144,000. In Jesus' name, amen.
So welcome everybody to the Youth Prophecy Group. This is meeting 110 and today is August 21st, 2022. The title of this week's lesson is Israel and the Conflict with Palestine. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the history of Israel-Palestine, and we're also going to be looking at how the far right likes Israel, or why the far right likes Israel, and why the far left likes Palestine. Extremism. You can find extremism on both the left and right of the political spectrum. We know that the far right has militia groups and is full of conspiracy theories and discrimination like sexism, racism, and white supremacy. But we also saw in the previous lesson, which was lesson 107, that a far left man planned to kill a U.S. Supreme Court justice after Roe v. Wade was overturned because, among other things, he didn't like that decision. From this example, we should be able to see that both the far right and the far left are dangerous, or can be dangerous. As we said earlier, this lesson is about Israel, and we shouldn't be surprised to learn that anti-Semitism is prevalent in the far right. Anti-Semitism is prejudice, discrimination, hatred, and/or hostility towards Jews. In the far right, you can find neo-Nazis, Holocaust deniers, conspiracy theories saying Jews run the Black Lives Matter, and conspiracy theories saying Jews orchestrated Jim Crow laws, which is sort of the opposite. But people in the far right believe both of those things. As another example, in the Unite the Right rally in Virginia in August of 2017, the people shouted, among other things, that they shouted, "Jews will not replace us." And on January 6th, some of the rioters wore shirts saying the 6 million Jews that died in the Holocaust was not enough. So from these examples, we can see that anti-Semitism can be found on the far right wing, but anti-Semitism isn't just found in the extreme region of the far right. For example, Donald Trump, on his first Holocaust Remembrance Day in August, he tweeted, of course, a statement which did not say Jews or anti-Semitism. All it said was innocent people. So, of course, most of the problems come from the right and the far right. But in this lesson, we're also going to look at the left. And the left is not innocent. So they both have wrong views of Israel and Jewish people. And both of them can be extreme. Both sides.
The history of Israel and Palestine. The history of Israel's conflict with Palestine can date as far back as the 1800s. Back in the 1800s, Palestine was populated by mainly Arab Muslims, and there are a few Jews and Christians. The majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, which was outside of Palestine. But in the late 1800s, Jews began to be more and more persecuted in Europe, so they decided to leave Europe and go to Palestine. This was called the Zionist movement, and it was formed in 1897. It mainly wanted to form a Jewish state in Palestine where all the Jews could live. Zionists believed that this state would be their homeland, and they began to call it the Land of Israel. Some organizations even formed to buy land from Palestine. But as we might expect, the Arabs in Palestine didn't like this idea, and as more Jews began to move in, violence sparked. One of the first violent events that happened that happened in Palestine against the Jews was when a Jewish guard accidentally shot an Arab in 1882. In response, 200 Arabs attacked the Jewish settlement. However, violence only increased when Britain took control. Previous to World War I, Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but as the war ended, the Ottomans were defeated and Britain took control of Palestine. During World War I, the Allies wanted the help of the Sharif of Mecca to defeat the Ottomans, and in return for his help, they promised to acknowledge the independence of Arab countries. The Sharif agreed, but unknowingly to him, Britain was more focused on its own agenda rather than holding up the deal. And Britain began to divide the spoil of the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, they made Palestine an international zone, and that violated their agreement with the Sharif to make Palestine independent, independent. Next, Britain made further moves to anger the Arabs. Britain saw Palestine as a buffer zone for the Suez Canal, and Jewish leaders in Britain convinced the government that the Zionist ambitions would benefit Britain's ambitions. So Britain began to support the two-nation theory, which is a Zionist theory that Jews want to establish a nation in Palestine, and therefore it will be two nations, one for the Jews, one for the Arabs. Partly due to the support from Britain, partly due to the support from Britain and the popularity of Zionism, Jewish immigration into Palestine increased, but as more immigration increased, violence also increased. In 1921, the first major anti-Jewish riots took place in Palestine. The Jaffa riots began as a riot or a fight amongst the Jews, but then it turned into a major anti-Jewish riot by the Arabs. 47 Jews were killed and 48 Arabs were killed in the riots. And since Britain controlled the area, it was responsible to manage the violence. And even though it saw how impractical all the Jewish immigration was into the area, Britain still continued to support the Zionist movement. In 1936, the deadliest riots in Palestine called the Great Revolution began. There were two phases in the Great Revolution. The first phase began in 1936. And 60,000 Jews had immigrated that year, or were still immigrating during that year, and the Arabs began to revolt. The Higher Arab Committee, which is an Arab organization, they helped organize the riots. They focused on strikes against the Jews and other forms of protest. By October, the British had suppressed the riots and the revolts, but the second phase began in late 1937. They started the second phase because the Arabs were mad at how the Jews had suppressed the first phase and they wanted revenge. So in the second phase, the Arabs mainly targeted the British army itself, and therefore the British had to target Arab villages in specific. Just as before, the British did eventually end the rebellion, but there were a lot of casualties. In total, from both phases, there are around 20,000 Arab casualties, with 5,000 deaths and 15,000 injured. And of course, that made the Arabs even more mad at the Jews, even though it was technically Britain, even though Britain was helping the Jews, though. And these riots prompted the British to support Zionism even stronger. They supported Zionist militias, and they caused a prominent Arab leader, and his name was al-Husseini. They caused a prominent Arab leader, him, to go into exile because of the riots. And this is a map of Palestine and the area around it. We see Egypt is right there, it's next to Jordan. And then in the top left, we can see where that is in relation to the rest of the world.
On May 14, 1948, Israel officially became a country. The United States and the Soviet Union recognized the country that same day. This, however, did not end the conflict between Israel and Palestine, instead making it worse. In August of 1948, the same year, an Israeli terrorist organization murdered the United States appointed mediator for Palestine. In 1956, a massacre took place and the Israelis killed many Palestinians from 3 different cities, including Palestinians. The killings continued, and by 1967, Israel occupied most of Palestine. In 1973, the United Nations told Israel to withdraw from the territory for the second time. They first told Israel to withdraw in 1967, but they didn't listen. In 1976, Israel took more land from the Palestinians, which resulted in brutal protests. In 1995, however, Israel and Palestine and the Palestine Liberation Organization signed an agreement that gave the Palestinians some freedom. In 1997, because of the agreement, Israel withdrew some of its troops from Hebron. That progress soon after started to be dismantled because in 2002, Israel sent its troops back to Palestinian cities. In 2008, 2012, and 2014, Israel attacked Gaza, which was a city owned by the Palestinians. The 2014 attack took place from July to August, and over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, more than half of them being civilians. But those are just some of the events after Israel became a country about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and it's still ongoing today. Flag.
Which flag? I think the flag on the right is Palestine's flag, and the flag on the left is Israel's flag.
The Evangelical Right's views of Israel. Despite what we saw earlier, not all of the right wing is anti-Semitic. Some people in the right wing actually love Israel. These people are far-right evangelicals who believe that Israel is in Bible prophecy at the end of the world. They think that Israel will be attacked by a northern country, which many think is Russia, with the help of Iran and other Arab countries. But according to them, by miraculous intervention, including giant hail and unexplained fighter jet explosions, no Israeli will die, and the attackers or invaders will be destroyed, and birds will eat their bodies. From Revelation, if you remember. After this, these evangelicals believe the rapture will take place, where they believe faithful Christians will be taken to heaven, and then the world will be engulfed in plagues and trouble, where more people will be converted, which I think they think some Jews will be converted, and then Jesus will come back again, and the rest of their idea of the end of the world. Because of these views, far-right evangelicals get excited whenever Iran is in the news, especially when it comes to war. They want the United States. Well, some people want the United States to start a war against Iran, and the United States and Israel to start a war against Iran. They also support the country of Israel because they believe the Jews have to be in Palestine for their version of the end of the world to take place. So they were very happy also when Israel became a country. They call for the United States to support Israel with things like weapons and other aid. And there's also an organization, which is what you see on the screen, the Christians United for Israel, which has a lot of millions of members, and they support Zionism. So they support Israel. These evangelicals aren't necessarily anti-Semitic, but they are right-wing, and instead they support Israel because they believe that Israel has a role in their version of end-time prophecy.
Obama and the nuclear deal. Obama's administration dealt a big blow to the far right's hopes of the end of the world. On May 22nd of 2015, President Obama, who's obviously on the right of the screen next to Joe Biden, he signed the Iran nuclear deal, or the Iran Agreement Review Act. The act was signed by several countries, namely several countries, and those countries are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, of course, the United States, and Germany. And together they're called P5+1. And of course, since it was dealing with Iran, Iran also signed the deal. And the deal was formally titled the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is JCPOA for short. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. The goal of the deal was to prevent Iran from reviving its nuclear weapons program and thus reduce the threat of nuclear war between Iran and its enemies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. Iran consented to dismantle most of its nuclear program that it had been working on, and it also agreed to let its facilities be more open to inspection. Previous to the deal, if Iran wanted a nuclear bomb, they could probably make one in a few months. But after the deal, Iran would take at least a year to make a nuclear bomb, which gave other countries enough time to respond. In the deal, Iran agreed to stop producing uranium or plutonium that could be used in a nuclear weapon, and it also agreed to let its nuclear facilities be only used for medical and industrial research, among other things. As we might expect, Iran just didn't agree to this for no reason without them benefiting in some way. President Obama removed sanctions on Iran's oil, letting it export more oil and make more money. Several countries also unfroze Iranian assets, which gave Iran access to about $100 billion. These were the terms in the negotiations of the Iran nuclear deal. Negotiations began as far back as 2003, with the final decision being made in 2015 and the deal going into effect in 2016. As we know, right-wing evangelicals would oppose this deal because it weakened Iran and then reduced the chance of it attacking Israel, and therefore their view of the end of the world would likely not happen as soon as they thought it was. So that's why the right wing opposed this deal. And in the picture, we know that's Obama and Biden. And then on the left corner is the map of Iran.
On May 18, 2018, President Trump announced that he was pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal by stating that he was placing sanctions on Iran's oil. The United States wasn't allowed to put sanctions on Iran as part of the deal. Therefore, by placing sanctions on Iran, the deal was essentially broken. Trump said that the deal wasn't actually preventing Iran from making a nuclear weapon. Therefore, he didn't think that the United States needed to be in it. Quoting from Vox, "The problem, though, is that the deal wasn't rotten." Trump called the deal rotten. "The best evidence we have suggests Iran was actually complying with the deal. Iran has dismantled a huge portion of its nuclear program and given international inspectors wide latitude to make sure it isn't cheating. The country is significantly further from a nuclear weapon than it was when the deal came into force." End quote. Quoting from the Washington Post. Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. That's the title of the Vox article. Quoting from the Washington Post in a minute. "The two main countries that supported the withdrawal were Saudi Arabia and Israel," now quoting from the Washington Post. "When Trump pulled out of the pact, much of the Israeli public cheered. Netanyahu took credit for making it happen, and Bennett hailed it as a great day for the free world." End quote. The evangelicals and Trump really ended the deal because it would give Iran the power to bring about the end of the world. So as I've said before, that they wanted Iran to attack Israel to bring about the end of the world. So by giving Iran access to nuclear weapons, they could do that. On May 14, 2018, the United States opened a new embassy in Jerusalem. This upset the Palestinians while making the Israelis very happy. It was opened on the worst day of the Gaza border protests when over 50 Palestinians were killed. Quoting from Reuters. The initiative was driven by President Donald Trump after he broke last year with decades of U.S. policy by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. End quote. By acknowledging that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, not Palestine, then moving the embassy there, Trump and the evangelicals clearly showed their support for Israel, since Jerusalem has long been fought over by Israel and Palestine. The picture is of the Iran flag, and on the left and on the right is all of the countries that were in the Iran nuclear deal. So by the United States ending the deal, or they're part of the deal, that doesn't technically mean that the deal is over, because there are a bunch of other countries in the deal, but it could mean that Iran will no longer hold their end of the deal anymore either.
And they're not.
Yeah.
Look at the news. In the news, they're not. Because the United States. The far left's views of Israel. As we mentioned before or earlier, there is extremism and hatred in the left wing as well as in the right wing. Israel is just one example. In July of 2005, a call to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel was put out and endorsed by over 150 Palestinian organizations, trade unions, charities, and people like activists and academics. This became the BDS movement. In 2007, people who supported these ideas came together in a conference, and the Palestinian BDS National Committee, or BNC, was formed. The next year, which was 2008, BNC became the leading organization of the BDS movement. But that only really applies to Palestine because BDS is global or international and it's purposely not very organized in other countries. The BDS movement supports the rights of Palestinian people and is deeply opposed to the country of Israel. They believe that Israel is like apartheid South Africa. What is happening in Israel to Palestinians, to them, is the same thing as what happened to Black South Africans in apartheid South Africa. And so they believe that Israel needs to be opposed just like South Africa was. They have three main goals, two of which relate to the rights of Palestinians, the rights and protections of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees. And the third is that they don't want the country of Israel to exist. A co-founder of BDS said that he doesn't want the country of Israel to exist in Palestine at all, but that will leave the Jews, that's not what he said, but that will leave the Jews without any protection from anti-Semitism from other Arab countries like Iran, which doesn't like Israel. BDS is anti-Zionist, and they are also anti-Semitic. Semitic according to several Jewish organizations, Israeli politicians, and even the U.S. House of Representatives that passed a resolution to condemn BDS a few years ago, and the German parliament did that as well. It is important to note, though, that some Jews do support BDS because they think that it is not anti-Semitic, but it is. But some people don't think it is. So, an example of BDS being anti-Semitic is the BDS group in Boston widely promoted a map that listed many organizations, including directly Jewish ones, saying that they supported the country of Israel, so they needed to be opposed and resisted in any way possible. And then they were called out on that and they retracted it, but they had supported it before. BDS is mostly supported on the left wing, with almost 50% of Democrats saying they support it, while more than 75% of Republicans say they do not support it. The squad is part of the far left that supports BDS, and in 2019, Ilhan Omar, which is a member of the squad, wrote a resolution that said people have the right to boycott. Now, she did not say BDS or Israel in this resolution, but before she published it, she said that the resolution would explain why she supported the BDS movement. So obviously, it's what she was talking about. The other three members of the squad, along with other members of the House of Representatives, also co-sponsored the resolution. In the resolution, Omar gave examples of the boycotts of Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa, applying that Israel is just like those two countries. Last year, in 2021, in the Washington, D.C., this is another example, the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Sunrise Movement, which is a movement that supports efforts against climate change. They said they would not speak at a rally supporting the making Washington, D.C. a state, which is also another left-wing idea. They said they would not speak there because some Jewish organizations that supported the state of Israel would be there as well. So here they're clearly being anti-Semitic because they didn't not only target Jewish organizations, but also Jewish organizations that supported Israel, when there were also other organizations going to be there that supported Israel as well. So they're clearly being anti-Semitic. And the national movement leadership didn't really condemn them for that. They didn't really, they said something, but it wasn't really an answer. So the far left hates Israel. And the main reason they hate Israel is because they don't like imperialism or colonialism. And they believe that that is what the country of Israel is. We saw the history of Israel and how Britain helped or really helped Jews move into Palestine, and the Jews were from Europe. So they believe the Jews were European, and since they were moving into this other area, that it's colonialism. So that's why a lot of the left does not like Israel. So as we can see, there's a broad hatred of the country of Israel in the left wing, and there is also a lot of anti-Semitism there. And this on the picture is a protest supporting BDS, and that is in France. So it's everywhere.
Understanding the far left. So understanding the far left is a thing that this movement is starting to do. There's more to the conflict between Israel and Palestine than just being external events. When we look at who supports who, we get a glimpse into the far left. In 2016, we know that there was an election, obviously, between Clinton and Trump. Clinton was the correct stream of information. But before the presidential election, there had to be a smaller election for each of the two political parties to choose their nominee, a presidential nominee. Clinton went up against Sanders in the Democratic conventions and she won. Clinton, as we know, is left wing and more moderate, while Sanders is further left. Sanders would not have been the right choice to go up against Trump. What we are understanding now is that we can no longer say the left wing is good and the right wing is bad. We now have to watch out for we not only have to watch out for the more conservatives in the left wing that like to compromise, but we also have to understand the far left and watch out for them because they have problems with their ideology. Of course, we know that there are still two streams of information, and even though it's just not the entire left wing that is the true stream of information, it's just part of the left wing that is the correct stream. Far left agenda can be just as anti-Semitic as the far right. And even though racism isn't the test for our time right now, we know that if you fail the test of racism, then you certainly fail the test of, excuse me, you certainly fail the test of gender. So even though we're saying the far left is anti-Semitic and racism isn't the test, we know that if you fail racism, you fail gender. So the far left can also be seen as sexist then, which is the test for our time. So the more we understand the views of the far left, the more we'll be able to sift through the correct stream of information, or sift through information and find the correct stream, because we know that the stream now is a lot narrower than simply being the entire left wing, but it's now that specific part of the left wing that we can use. So in summary, we first looked at extremism on the far right and on the far left. And we saw that extremism can exist on the far right. We know a lot of people on the far right are anti-Semitic and sexist and all of that. And we saw that they were also anti-Semitic, but we were going to look at that more in the later part of the lesson. And we saw how Trump may not be extreme, like he might not be in a militia or something protesting in the streets, but he can still be anti-Semitic and he's still far right. And then we looked at the history of Palestine and Israel. In 1897, the Zionist movement formed, and it formed as a result of people moving to, or Jews moving to Palestine. In 1917, Britain conquered Palestine and took control of the affairs going on there. In 1921, the first major anti-Jewish riots took place, and they were by Arabs, of course, Arabs versus the Jews. In 1936, the Great Revolution began, which was another anti-Jewish riot, but it was much on a larger scale than in 1921. In 1948, in 1948, Israel became a country, and that further made the Arabs angry because not only had all the Israel moved in and started taking their land, but then they got their own country. So in 1956, a lot of massacres were taking place in 3 different Palestinian cities. In 1995, the PLO gave the Palestinians some more freedoms, but in 2002, Israel sent their troops back into Palestinian cities. And of course, that caused more violence, namely one in 2014 when 2,000 Palestinians were killed in an attack. Then we looked at the right-wing evangelical view of Israel, because we can say there's 2 different views of Israel in the right wing. One of them is just the anti-Semitic view that they don't care about other countries. They just like the United States the best. But then there's the evangelical view on Israel that they like Israel because they think it's going to bring about their view of the end of the world. And so they support Israel. Then we saw in 2015 the nuclear deal was signed, which made Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon limited. And then that's why in 2018 Trump backed out of the deal, because he's influenced by the right-wing evangelicals and they want Iran to be able to get a bomb because then it'll have the chance of attacking its enemy Israel and bringing about the end of the world, or their version of the end of the world. So that's why they influenced Trump to get out of the nuclear deal. We looked at the far left's view on Israel. We saw that the far left actually hates Israel because they think it's being colonialist and imperialist like other countries in the past, and they don't like that. So they especially are very anti-Semitic, and the BDS movement is one of those far left anti-Semitic organizations that deeply opposes Israel and Jews. And our view on the far left is that we don't support them. We aren't far right, we aren't far left, we aren't center right, we are centrist. We're just in between, in the left, in between centrist and far left. So it's just normal left. And we don't support their anti-Semitic views because we know they are anti-Semitic. And we avoid far left sources of information wherever we can.
So does anybody have any questions or comments on the lesson or just the message in general? You can say it, you can type it in the chat. Okay, if not. Oh, yes, we have a raised hand. You can unmute and speak. Oh, we'll just type it in the chat then, that's fine.
Oh, we good. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I don't know exactly your fault. I think it could have been a mistake on our part. But yes, sorry about the beginning of the presentation. We will send the recording and the notes though. And I believe you're on the mailing list. If not, okay, if not, we'll send you the recording. Or if not, send us your email and we'll send you that. But okay, anti-Semitism is hatred or hostility, discrimination against Jews. So it's like, yeah, it's against Jews, discrimination and hatred. Probably hard to find. Yeah, prejudice, discrimination, hatred, and or hostility against Jews. So that's what anti-Semitism is. So I hope that answered your question, and we will get you the beginning of the presentation.
Okay, so now for the quiz. The first question is, does the far evangelical right support Israel or Palestine? Does the far evangelical right support Israel or Palestine? Let's see. You can put the answers in the chat or you can unmute. So it is C, the far evangelical right to support Israel because it will bring about their end of the world view. Next question, does the far left support Israel or Palestine? Does the far left support Israel or Palestine? Yes, so the far left does support Palestine because they think Israel is imperialist and they don't like imperialism. Third question, what does BDS stand for and which side supports it? What does it stand for and which far left or the far right, which side supports it? Or the majority side? D, and yes, that is correct. The far left supports the BDS movement and boycott, divest, and sanction. Fourth question. Which president signed into law the Iran nuclear deal that the evangelicals didn't like? Which president signed into law the Iran nuclear deal? H. Yes, it was President Obama, and evangelicals didn't like it because it limited Iran couldn't make nuclear deals, so they couldn't blow up Israel, so they couldn't make nuclear deals, nuclear weapons, so they couldn't blow up Israel and into the war come. Last question: where did Trump move the U.S. embassy that he recognized as part of the capital of Israel and not Palestine? Where did he move it? Jerusalem. A. Yes. Yeah, so the name of the city is Jerusalem, which he recognized as a part of Israel. So yeah, it's also Israel too.
Except that the capital of the embassy was already in Israel. I believe it was in Tel Aviv, and then he moved it to Jerusalem. So it was already in Israel, but Jerusalem is in Israel.
So congratulations, everybody. Thank you for your participation.
So thank you everybody for coming. If you want notes, if you have questions, or if you want updates or recordings, you can contact us at youthprophecygroup@gmail.com. And the next meeting will be in 2 weeks on September 4th, 2021. 2022.
Let's close with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for being with us, and thank you for giving us this message. Thank you for letting us understand that we cannot be in the extreme of either side of the political spectrum. And thank you for letting us understand more of the left wing so that we know exactly what part we need to get our information from news so that we don't develop wrong ideas of what's happening in the world. Thank you for calling us to be part of the 144,000, and please give us the understanding and the ability to be teachers so that we can teach this message to everyone, the Levites, the Nethinims, and those in heaven. Be with us during this upcoming week. Give us the power to exemplify your character all the time. In Christ's name, amen.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.